I want to tell you about two more phenomena in social psychology that lead to prejudice. The first one is the just world hypothesis. And the just world hypothesis says that people get what they deserve, that somehow justice just sort of happens. So good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. It's a defense mechanism. The world is a scary place, right? People become homeless, they get cancer, they end up in abusive relationships. These are awful things. They could happen to any of us. How do we defend against that? Remember Freud's defense mechanisms? Well, one of them is a just world hypothesis. Like, oh, they got cancer. They must not have been living the healthy life that I lead. They lost their job. Well, they must not have been working very hard. I work very hard, so I'm different from them. See, the overall purpose of the just world hypothesis is to distance yourself from people who are suffering by saying, I deserve what I have. There's a reason that I have what I have, and it's a reason that I can control. That you don't have it? Well, guess you didn't control it. And this little cartoon about big fish eating smaller fishes, this is a real issue with the just world belief in the US. People who have a lot of power, a lot of money, they believe that they got their power and money because they deserved it and other people didn't. They worked harder than everybody else. People who are disempowered, who don't have money, believe that the world is unfair, and that's why they're in their situation. So, how does a just world belief lead to cruelty? Well, if something bad happens to someone else, it must be because they did something to deserve it. That homeless person? Oh, that homeless person is entirely different from me, right? That person is homeless because of something they did. They didn't try hard enough, or they're an addict and they couldn't work hard enough to overcome it. That could never happen to me, right? They got cancer because they led an unhealthy lifestyle. I lead a healthy lifestyle, so that couldn't possibly happen to me. That's the just world belief. It leads to victim blaming. Bad things happen to bad people, so if something bad happened to you, you must be a bad person. Me, I'm a good person. That's why it didn't happen to me. It also justifies cruelty to others. So, for example, in the United States, we have been separating children from their family, from their parents, if the children belong to folks who are trying to immigrate to the U.S. This is really strange, right? Because we're a country of immigrants, largely. So why are we separating children from their parents? Well, because they shouldn't have immigrated to this country. And I can't tell you how many people I know, people in my own family, who are first-generation Californians, first-generation Americans, and they look at other people who would be first-generation Americans and say, oh, they're bad. But what happened to me? We're fine. The just world hypothesis is really painful to watch in the U.S. because the U.S. has one of the worst income inequalities in the entire world. The latest evidence suggests that the only country in the world that has worse income inequality is Uganda. And this is a country where we believe that if you just work hard, anybody can succeed. How do those two ideas fit together? What do I mean by income inequality? What I mean is the richest people in the U.S. have a huge amount more money than the poorest people in the U.S. So let's use this analogy of this map. The richest 1% of people in the U.S. have about half of all the money in the U.S. The poorest 40% of people in the U.S., you can't even see what they own. In the bottom of Texas there's a teeny red dot. That's how much money the poorest 40% of Americans have. So small you can't even see it, right? If we talk about the 10% most wealthy people in the US, then they own, look at that horizontal line. They own everything, or all the wealth that is accounted for by everything above that horizontal line. So huge income inequality in the US. How do we understand it? Well, if you have an enormous amount of money, it must be because you worked harder than anybody else. And if you're poor, it must be because you're lazy. That's the just world hypothesis. It's blaming poor people for being poor, not because the US is structured so that the richest people get the vast majority of the money and resources. And that's what accounts for why the rich are so rich and the poor are so poor. But that's not the attribution that we make. According to the just world hypothesis, if you're in the bottom 40%, and think about 40%, I mean, we're talking about like half of America. If you're in the bottom 40% of income and wealth in the US, it must be because that's what you deserve. And if you're in the top 10% and have the vast majority of the money and resources in the US, then that must be because that's what you deserve. See how nasty that is? Related to the just world hypothesis is something called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Some people use the word fake it till you make it as a description of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Self-fulfilling prophecy says, if you predict that something's going to happen to you, then you will unintentionally behave in ways that increase the likelihood that that thing's actually going to happen. Maybe somebody who's failing in school has an exam coming up, and that person starts studying for the exam and then concludes, it doesn't matter how much I study, I'm going to fail the exam. So guess what happens to students who don't study for the exam? They fail it. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Our behaviors encourage other people to act in ways that confirm our expectations of them and of us. So students who feel like they don't deserve much, that they don't deserve a professor's help, they don't reach out for extra help that they deserve just as much as anybody else. And so what happens? They don't perform as well in classes, and as a result, they feel like, see, I don't deserve any resources or assistance. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Thanks.